Welcome to DLS's teacher training module on error correction for intensive proficiency-based training. Let's get started. As an instructor, you need to correct your students' mistakes a lot. Some instructors may feel that the corrections should be minimal. So if you see the cartoon on the left, after all, your student is an adult, and if they are able to understand the message of what you're saying or express themselves, that should be good enough. But other instructors feel that the student must learn to say everything correctly from the start and continue to do so. So these instructors will correct their students all the time. Which type of instructor are you? What's your preferred method? When correcting your students, you should keep the following points in mind. Do you correct in English or in the target language? Is your student familiar with the correction methods that you use? And finally, you need to be aware of how the student's personality or language level may affect the way you correct the student. All this will definitely affect the efficiency and the results of the corrections you provide. Here are our objectives for this training. By the end of this training, you will have a better idea of how to choose what to correct and what not to correct. You'll be able to understand who should do the correcting, and then we will take a look at when is the best time to correct and how to do correction more efficiently. You're probably familiar with the term formative assessment. Formative assessment is an integral part of the teaching process. It helps you constantly adjust your teaching so that you can achieve your goals more efficiently. So, as an instructor, you start by setting the objectives, goals, and standards that you want your student to achieve. This allows you to deliver targeted instruction and informed teaching. You then assess your students. You see how well they're doing, and this allows you to collect data about their progress. Once you have that data, you use that information to modify the learning process, so you respond to the data. And then you can set new goals, new objectives, and you begin the cycle again. Now, as you know, students make a lot of different types of mistakes as they're learning a new language. Let's take a look at some of the most common types of mistakes that teachers encounter. So mistakes can be grammatical, relating to grammar or grammar structures, maybe a conjugation error, for example. They can be lexical, which means they're related to vocabulary. So maybe a student chooses the wrong word, for example. Of course, they can be phonological or related to pronunciation. They might be syntactic mistakes, so related to word order. Of course, a student might make a mistake with register, and register just means formality, how formal or informal the language we're using is. So the student might use a word that's too formal in everyday conversation, or the opposite, in a more formal setting, they might use a word that's too informal or too casual. Now, some mistakes might come from first language or maybe an additional language if the student speaks another language. And those mistakes are called interference when they're making a mistake based off of a rule in their first or additional language. And then, of course, we're familiar with mistakes of misunderstanding. So the student misinterprets something that they hear or something that they read. Now that we've looked at types of errors and we can see that students make many different mistakes, how do we choose what to correct? Should we correct every pronunciation error or every vocabulary error? Well, when choosing what to correct, one thing to keep in mind is the goal of whatever activity we're doing with the student. And one question we can ask ourselves is, in this activity, are we striving more for accuracy or for fluency? So, for example, let's say you're doing a proficiency-based activity. So here, your focus is on achieving communication and meaningful use of language. Here, you don't want to correct every error the student makes because that's going to suppress their fluency. And the student might stop talking or they might hesitate a lot because they're thinking so much about what they're saying. So if you're doing a proficiency-based activity, what you might do is note down some patterns that you see of error, and then you might correct those after the activity is over. Now, let's say you're focused on an accuracy-based activity. So this is something you might do when you're focusing on a new grammar structure or new vocabulary that you've recently taught. And here your goal is to give the student a lot of practice using the language correctly. Often these activities often have smaller amounts of language, so the student might be producing just sentences, whereas in a proficiency-based activity, they might be producing maybe strings of sentences or paragraphs as they speak. So if you're doing an accuracy-based activity, you might focus your correction on whatever grammar structure or vocabulary or feature of pronunciation that you're trying to teach your student. Take a few moments to consider this question. Who should do the correction? Should it always be the instructor, or should the student be able to self-correct? Is self-correction an important skill to learn? And then, in your opinion and in your experience, is having students correct each other in a group class effective? If so, why or why not? You may be thinking, based on your experience, that self-correction can have several benefits. One benefit, of course, is that if the student says something themselves, they're more likely to remember it. And then, of course, it builds up the student's learner autonomy. They can eventually start to correct themselves more of the time and maybe even catch themselves before they make those errors. What are some techniques that you use to promote self-correction? And we're going to look at that later on in this presentation. To answer the question, who should do the correction, let's take a look at this quotation. Any behavior on the teacher's part which encourages guesses, including wrong ones, will also encourage the process of learning. Now here, guesses refers to when the students try to guess what the correct way to formulate their thoughts are. So what this quotation is saying is that anything that the teacher can do to help the student notice there's a mistake and encourage or prompt them to make their own corrections will encourage the process of learning. So getting students to try to figure out what the mistake is and how to say it correctly is going to encourage the process of learning. Let's look at the second part. The idea that mistakes are a natural and essential part of learning must be transmitted to students. Let's take a look at this in the next slide. When it comes to dealing with errors in your class, how strict or easygoing are you? Take a moment to skim through these descriptions and choose the one that best fits you. Are you strict? You never let your students make mistakes? Are you more medium, correcting sometimes but not all the time, and perhaps making adjustments based on the goal of your activity? Or are you easygoing, so you try to correct as little as possible? Which one best fits you? So hopefully in the last slide, you said that you were the medium corrector. That is the best answer for that question. And let's take a look at why the other two are not ideal. So the heavy corrector, this is the person who is very strict and tries to correct every mistake. One problem with that is that it's very teacher-centered. And this means that learning can be subjugated to teaching. So it kind of stifles the learning process, that level of correction. And one thing that goes along with that is that it can limit how creative the student feels the freedom to be. If the student is corrected all the time, they may start to feel like they're being punished, and they may not feel comfortable being creative. We want to reward creativity in our classes. Another consequence of heavy correction is that students tend to become very cautious. So their fluency may suffer. They may take a long time to formulate sentences. They might have a lot of hesitations and pauses as they try to figure out the correct way to say things. Students also may start to get kind of obsessed with being correct and not making mistakes. And then heavy correction can affect the classroom environment. It may start to feel a little tense because students might feel worried about making mistakes. So now we know some of the problems with heavy correction, with really strict correction. Let's take a look at the other side. So this is the person who is very easygoing, the instructor who is a non-corrector. And let's look at why this is also not ideal. So the biggest problem here is fossilized mistakes. You're probably familiar with this term. This just means when a student has repeated a mistake so often and for so long that the student actually learns it in the mistaken form. They think that's the rule. So this is something that happens over time, but once it takes place, it is very difficult to get the student to stop making that error because they've learned it the wrong way. So we always want to prevent fossilization from happening. Another consequence is that students will complain about being corrected too little. That might sound crazy, but you may have experienced this if you were an easygoing instructor at any point. Students do value accuracy, and they want to know how to say things correctly, and they're aware of how people will perceive them outside of the class if they make a lot of mistakes. So students do want to be corrected. Another consequence is that if students never get corrected, they may start to feel anxious. And we saw that kind of with the heavy corrector as well. But students may start to worry about the teacher's ability. They may think, am I not making any mistakes? Does the teacher know the rule? Is the teacher something's not happening that should happen? So the student may start to feel anxious. And then, of course, whoever is observing the class, so maybe it's someone from the student's agency, maybe it's an LTS, If they see the student making repeated errors or they never observe any correction, they might start to wonder, why didn't the teacher correct the student? So now let's look at some techniques for correcting students. Which of these 8 error correction techniques are you familiar with? Take a moment and brainstorm the meaning of these error correction techniques. Let's look at the second technique. Here, the student makes an error. I moved here since 2 years. The teacher repeats the student's words, but provides the correction. So the teacher says, you moved here 2 years ago. So here the teacher repeats pretty much exactly what the student has said, but they change and correct it. And this technique is called recast. Here's our third technique. The student makes a mistake. It will start on May, and the teacher directly clarifies and points out what is wrong. So the teacher says, not on May, in May. We say it will start in May. So the teacher explicitly shows the error here and gives the correction. Sometimes the teacher might also provide an explanation. So they might say why it's correct. And this technique is called explicit correction. So the teacher says exactly what's wrong and why it's wrong. Here's our next technique. The student says, I go to the beach on Saturday. And the teacher seems to be unsure about what the student means here. So she asks a question. She says, you go to the beach every Saturday? And this prompts the student to provide clarification or hopefully correction. So here the student says, no, I went to the beach on Saturday. So we can see that originally the student had made a tense error, an error in verb tense. So in this technique, the teacher indicates that he or she has not understood what the learner said. So they might ask a question or ask a clarification question. And this technique is called clarification request. Here's our next technique. The student says an error. So the student says, I'll come if it won't rain. Now we know that the student should say, I'll come if it doesn't rain. We know that's correct. So the teacher repeats part of the sentence. The teacher says, I'll come if it, and then this hopefully prompts the student to think about what they said and then try to correct what they said. So here the teacher repeats part of the learner's sentence, but does not repeat the part with the mistake. And the teacher uses rising intonation to signal that the learner should complete it. So this is a technique that prompts self-correction from the student. And this is called elicitation. Here's our next technique. The student makes a mistake. Yesterday I go to the cinema. I should say went. And the teacher doesn't say anything. Instead, the teacher gestures with their hand, maybe over their shoulder. So she's showing the student it's in the past. It's in the past. So here, the teacher uses a gesture to give a clue. And this is a technique to prompt self-correction from the student. So hopefully what will happen here is the student will realize what the teacher is showing them and will say, oh, yesterday I went to the cinema. And this technique is called paralinguistic clue. In this technique, we see the student makes an error. Yesterday I go shopping. And the teacher tells them the grammar rule. So the teacher says, remember to use the past tense of go. So the teacher is telling them it's a past tense error. So here, the teacher explains what was wrong in the student's sentence, and we see again that this is a technique to prompt student self-correction. So here, hopefully the next sentence will be the student saying, ah, yes, went. Yesterday I went shopping. So this is a technique for self-correction. And this is called a metalinguistic clue. In this technique, this is our final technique, we see the student makes an error. Student says, I am born in Tokyo. And the teacher here doesn't say anything. The teacher is just silent, but they give a very confused look. So their face is probably like, and you can tell the teacher is confused. So in this technique, the teacher makes a facial expression or is silent or gives some kind of clue to show the student that they have made a mistake. And again, of course, since the teacher doesn't say anything here, this is definitely a technique to prompt student self-correction. And this is called indication of existence of a mistake. So this is quite similar to the elicitation technique we saw earlier. The only difference is that in elicitation, the teacher repeats part of the student's sentence. And in this technique, the teacher says nothing. The teacher is totally silent. Okay, great job. So those are our 8 error correction techniques. As you saw, some of them are techniques where the teacher gives the correction, but many of them are techniques for prompting student self-correction. Because as we talked about earlier, that's really one of the most effective ways to help students speak more accurately. So which of these methods or techniques do you use the most? Or maybe which one have you never used and which one might you like to try? So after the error correction, what happens next? As teachers, we might ask ourselves a few questions after the student has made these mistakes. So we might ask ourselves, does my student know the rule behind this mistake? Why did he or she make this mistake? And this is a really important one. Is he consistently confused about this topic? So is this something persistent? So now here are a few practical tips that you can use in your class after you've done all of those great error correction techniques that we talked about. One thing you can do is you can ask the student to compile the corrections you've given for later review. So often students might take notes in their notebook. If you give a correction, you can ask them to go through their notebook and maybe choose the top 3 errors that they want to work on. If you notice a pattern of error, so the past tense, for example, or any kind of systematic error, it's a great idea to assign some drills and exercises to help the student work on that. If you think the student maybe is having trouble understanding the grammar point, you can ask them to teach it to you. Um, this is a great way to kind of get the student to externalize their thinking. It can also be really helpful to show you what they understand and what they don't understand. A classic activity is to ask the student to create 10 sentences related to that grammar point. Or you could also design tasks that require use of the structure. So if they are having trouble with the future tense, you ask them to plan a trip and tell you what they're going to do. Another great activity is we looked at a lot of the techniques we looked at are for immediate correction, but delayed correction is also so valuable. So what you can do is as the student is talking, you can write down some of their errors, and then at the end of the day or at the end of the week, you can show them what you've written down and see if the student can self-correct those. Another thing you can do is you can record the student as they're talking, and then you can have the student listen to the recording and see if they can find some of their mistakes. So maybe ask them to find 5 mistakes and see if they can correct. And then, of course, you want to, if you notice patterns of errors, you want to revisit those. So you might include some of that on the student's weekly assessment. And then you want to revisit it or recycle it in the future. So in another week, in 2 weeks, or next month. All right, thank you so much. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to your LTS.